Hi everyone. As I promised the other day when I did my video on the review of Ferris Wheel Press fountain pens and inks, I wanted to do an actual project where I painted with the inks. Now I know that these inks are not watercolor inks, they're technically, but they are water soluble and they are not permanent, so I wanted to give them a try and use them as watercolors, and the vibrancy is absolutely outstanding. I did have a limited number of inks, but I think the project turned out beautifully. However, as I was doing it, I realized I should have done a few things differently, so I wanted to share that with you. It is not the fault of the product, but user error. First of all, let's go over the colors I'm using. I do have, as I said, a very limited palette, but I thought it was well suited to this project. So right now I'm painting with a very beautiful magenta color called Sugar and Spite. And of course magenta is one of my favorite colors. I did try dropping in a wet on wet technique. This is on hot press paper, and that was my first thing that I should have changed. I should have had cold press paper. It stays wetter longer, and so the hot press paper was drying out very quickly. So the wet on wet didn't work as well as I think it should have. The inks are very pigmented, but I was a little disappointed that they didn't just shoot forth like I had anticipated that they would. I did have to coax them a little bit. They do that later when I'm doing pure water and then drop it in immediately. It was much more active, but I think I let this dry a little bit too long because it was hot press paper and it dried so quickly. What I'm dropping in is Grape Ice Pop. Then later on the leaves, the two greens that I have are Twinkling Tea Party and Emerald Gardens. Now, Emerald Gardens is a more grass green color, if you will. Then Twinkling Tea Party is a deeper, darker green. So I used those two, and then I dropped in Cherry Sonata. It's kind of a cherry, brownish cherry color. I did that in the leaves in order to make it look like blemishes. Some of my other Magnolia paintings, I gave them lots of blemishes and interest and texture. I was trying to do that here. I think it worked in the end, as particularly after I glazed over it one final time. But those are the colors I'm using, and again, that was Sugar and Spite, Twinkling Tea Party, Emerald Gardens, Cherry Sonata, and Grape Ice Pop. You can see here how vivid and clear the ink color is. I was very impressed with the color of the magenta. It was bright and vivid, even though I put it on in a very sheer layer, and it still had vibrancy and pop. The green as well, beautiful green, very clear, genuine color. If you guys are enjoying my videos, would you mind giving me a like and a subscribe if possible? That would be awesome. You can always unsubscribe later if you feel like the content's not serving you well, but that would mean a lot to me, and it would help me get my content out there. I've put a couple of layers on here on the magenta flowers and one layer of the leaves, so I felt like it was time to let it dry completely. And now I'm going back in and I'm doing additional petals, as you can see. And I did do some of them a little bit different. This is clear water, and I wanted to try to put more water so that it didn't dry so quickly as when I put just magenta down, because I'm going to try and drop in wet on wet that ink, and it doesn't disappoint. It still doesn't move quite as quickly as watercolors do for me, so I'm often tilting my little palette there to get it to move. It does move, and it does do a beautiful job of creating texture and variance in color, but I did have to coax it a little bit. And I'm doing this petal the same way. I did just after dropping in that water in the previous petal and then dropping the ink into it. You can see I just, after tilting a little bit to coax it, I just left it alone. I wanted to see what it would do without me adding the brush to it and coaxing it further along the petal, and I just think it's absolutely beautiful. Now I do come over later because I needed some color at the tip of the petal, and I do very gently add a very light layer of magenta ink. But this petal I'm doing the same way. You can see that I'm coaxing the water all the way through, and now I'm getting ready to drop that ink in. And it operates the exact same way as the last petal, and I did have to tilt it to coax it, but it winds up being absolutely stunning. Here I'm starting to work on the stem, and I picked up the darker green, and I have flooded that with water to do wet on wet with the ink. I wanted a lot of texture in the stem, but the darker ink was really dark and very highly pigmented, so it was a little bit off-putting at first. However, it wound up being beautiful. I did dry off my brush and try to pick up some of the water, and then added some more of the lighter green, which I'm doing here, to hopefully intermingle those colors. So I'm tilting, allowing them to mix. However, the darker green quickly overpowered the lighter green. But I think it wound up working well. Now here I'm picking up some of that ink with my brush and refining the edges. I didn't go all the way to the pink magenta. I knew I could fill that in later. I just didn't want the pink and the green to touch and bloom into each other. You can see already that the green is lightening up, and you can see the lighter green much more easily. And again, I'm dropping in more ink. What I'm doing here is putting clear water over this leaf, and I'm going to drop in the Cherry Sonata and the darker green in order to get those blemishes that I wanted. I was hopeful that in the water they would spread out and create really unique shapes, but again, the ink didn't flow quite as far as I had hoped that it would. However, it did make really pretty blemishes, but it was a little bit darker than probably I would have preferred in the end. You can see here on this leaf, it did diffuse and disperse, and it does look much more subtle, and I really like that. That way there's no defined edges between the blemishes. So it looked really, really attractive once it had settled in. And you can see on the stem, that is Cherry Sonata at the top that I had dropped in at the end, and it looks, I think, really pretty in that dark green and then contrasting to the medium or light green color. With this petal, again, I'm doing the clear water, and I'm going to drop in the magenta. I really liked the way that worked on those other two petals. After I dropped the ink in, I did tilting again, and I don't know if I cut it all out, but I did a lot of stopping and waiting to see how the ink was going to respond in the water, and then on the wet in and of itself. I tried to cut as much of that out, but please note it didn't go as rapidly as what I am showing here in the final product, because I didn't want to bore you to tears. But I did do a lot of stopping and thinking, what is it doing? What should I do next? What would be a good idea to do? Because this was an experiment, and I didn't want to just rush through it. I wanted to try and achieve a really beautiful product in the end. So I was thinking and planning as I went. So you may see a lot of that just open air doing nothing. That was me thinking what to do next. And you will see that third petal, when I put the water and dropped the ink in, it flowed like the other two that I did that way, and I think that effect is absolutely gorgeous. So I'm dropping in water again, and then I'm taking my brush and picking a lot of the water up. That is because, again, this is hot press paper, and the water is just puddling on top. So even though I added water, I had to go back in and take some of it off so it wasn't just a little river sitting up there. This is definitely the ugly stage on these leaves. They look like they have some sort of vile disease, but I think we get through it, and they look good in the end. And that's something that I like to encourage myself as well as others. When you're painting and you look down at whatever stage you're in and think, this is unrecoverable, this is the ugliest thing I have ever seen, and there's no way, there's no hope, please don't quit. You don't have anything to lose by continuing to paint on it. You can do washes. Washes help so much, and they really brought these leaves together in the end. The spots stood out so vivid and in high contrast to the leaves. They just looked absurd in the beginning. But when I did a wash in the end, it softened the entire leaf and brought those blemishes and those high contrast spots. It kind of corralled them and controlled them and brought the intensity down. So let me encourage you, no matter how ugly or how out of control you feel your painting is, don't stop. As I said, you have nothing to lose to try to keep going and make it better. Here I'm starting to paint the little turnback edges of, I think there's 3 petals that have turnback edges. And I wanted them light, but in contrast to the white paper, they look darker than a couple of those petals. So that's why I decided later to, on that first petal or that first turnback, I went in and took a light layer of magenta and then added some shading just so it would look more in contrast to the petal. And here's where I'm adding a very, very light layer of magenta on that petal. I don't want to lose that beautiful intermingling of the paint, or the ink as it entered the water and flowed through. I don't want to lose that, but I did need to put something in there to define where the petals were. I knew I was not going to add a background, and without some color there, you would not know where the petals ended and the background began. So on all of the petals with the wash, I just put a light layer of watered down magenta ink. I will add shading showing where that petal turns back a little bit later. Now I'm beginning to add some defining lines. I don't know if this is botanically correct, but I wanted to add some lines in there to give it more flow and movement and detail. And this is also, I believe, where I start to add some shadow along those lines. Now that is trying to help define where the first petal is and place that second petal visually behind it. And there I'm adding some shadow under that turn back. I did have a challenge doing a shadow with the ink and with the water and the ink, because it wanted to leave a hard edge, and so I had to even go in quickly back here with the water. You can see it still looks hard, but I worked at it, kept trying to feather it, and now you can see it's looking much better. However, I'm losing some of that lightness in that petal, so I took my paper towel and a couple of times and dabbed it, but in the end I was able to get it to feather out and not have a hard edge. Here I'm adding that shading from the turned back petal to a nearly white petal. As I put that shading in, again, I'm working with a hard edge, and so I took my brush and tried to just gently filter it out. And then, of course, I'm dabbing with my paper towel again. It did color in that petal a little bit more than I had planned, but I think in the end it turned out pretty, and I was able to soften that edge. I wanted to apologize for the camera going in and out of focus. Off screen, I kept putting my head too far in, and so it would see my hair and it would focus on that, putting the painting out of focus. I have since learned how to set up better, but I did want to apologize for that. I thought, well, I'm going to put this video out anyway since I promised, and I do think there's a lot to see and to learn. But again, I just wanted to apologize and ask for your grace and patience on this as I'm getting better at videoing to present tutorials and things for you guys. So just wanted to say I'm sorry. Here I'm adding a glaze in, I believe it's the lightest green, over the leaves, and this is where you're going to see those dark spots, the leaf blemishes, kind of meld into the background and fade away. Glazes pull everything together, and it will cause them to be unified. That was one of the first things I learned that I felt like really helped my painting, is when I learned how to glaze. And you'll see here I'm glazing over that white area for that stem. It's not been painted to this point, so I'm going to just completely glaze over it as well to give it a pale green color. And now I'm going to glaze the stem as well to bring down that cherry color that I dropped in. I love that color, but it did need to be muted somewhat and to bring both the green and the cherry into unity. And it's time to take the tape off. I've let it completely dry. And these little cards that I use, I buy them in a package from Amazon, and I'll try to remember to link them below. They come in hot press and cold press. But the cool thing about these little cards is they can be framed. They're a 5x7. However, what I do a lot of the time is I crop them down just a little bit, and then I put them on colored greeting cards that I've also bought on Amazon, and it makes a great greeting card. So with as much as I paint, I've got paintings stacked everywhere in these baskets, so I thought, what better way to use my art than to just make cards and make them into birthday cards and thank you cards and send them to my friends. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this little tutorial using Ferris Wheel Press inks. Again, if you would like, subscribe, and tap the bell for reminders, I would greatly appreciate it. And please leave comments about anything that you were thinking or that stood out to you below. Thank you guys so much.